Hey, what's up? My name is Daniela and today I'm here with my December wrap-up. So December was my best reading month, quantity-wise and probably quality-wise as well. I read a total of 10 books. 9 were adult and 1 was a children's book. 3 were classics or modern classics. 2 were historical, 1 was non-fiction, 1 was dystopian. 1 was a thriller, 1 was sci-fi and 1 was contemporary. 8 of them were physical and 2 were audiobooks. And I had 1 2-star, 1 3-star, 5 4-star and 3 5-star ratings. Also 4 of these were rereads for me. I'm going to go from the lowest rated book to the highest rated, and there will be timestamps in the description, so feel free to skip around. The first book I'm going to talk about is A Stranger in the House by Shari Lapena. In this thriller, a woman is suspected of a murder of a guy, and she claims that she doesn't remember anything about the night, and her husband starts to realize that he actually doesn't know that much about her. I read The Couple Next Door by this author, and I thought that the plot was ridiculous and writing wasn't very good, but it was quite fun, so I decided to pick this up on script because I needed something easy to listen to, but I ended up really not liking it. The story was not that thrilling. I didn't care about the reveal, the characters were unlikable caricatures, the plot dragged, and I didn't like the writing either. And then the reveal came and I was like, why would you even use a plot twist like this? I can imagine that you could make a point like this in a totally different story, but in this one it was used only for the shock value, except for the fact that by this time I really didn't care. I really didn't appreciate this ending and it pissed me off a little bit. I felt like I wasted my time with this book and I gave it 2 stars. Next book I'm going to talk about is Big Magic: Creative Living Beyond Fear by Elizabeth Gilbert. This is a non-fiction book by the author of Eat, Pray, Love, and it's about creative life and her experiences as a writer. I had pretty high expectations for this book and I ended up being underwhelmed. When I read this type of non-fiction, I want it to be either highly informative or motivating and inspiring or thought-provoking, and this book didn't give me enough value in any of these areas. Also, I listened to this on audiobook and I would probably enjoy it a bit more if I read it on my own because I wasn't the biggest fan of the narration, which the author did herself. It wasn't a bad book, but it was disappointing and I gave it 3 stars. Next, I finally read The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. In this dystopian book, the oppressive regime deals with low birth rates by stripping women of their freedom and making giving birth to healthy children their only task in life. Women who are not deemed fit to have children are basically sent to their deaths, and the same awaits our main character Offred if she steps out of line of the rigid rules of her new existence. She has lost not only her freedom but also her family, and now she is desperate to find out information not only about the regime but also about the possibility of meeting her loved ones again. We didn't get much world building in this one because Offred herself didn't find out that much before she was placed in the house where she lives now, and it was slightly irritating, but it was just the angle the author chose. I was kind of surprised by the style of the narration because Offred is, yes, miserable, but she's also sarcastic and we basically see her every step. So it's very slow paced and we also get glimpses of how her life used to be, which was heartbreaking. Offred is a clever woman and she tries to analyze what other characters who play different roles in the society might feel, because handmaids like her are not the only group of people who are controlled and forced to do stuff. At the beginning I actually wasn't sure if I was going to be able to get through it, but I got into it pretty quickly and I became intrigued by the story, although it was horrifying to read about this world. I thought that the book was well written, although the style felt a little bit peculiar, but I thought that it matched the story well. I'm glad I finally read it because I was putting it off for a very long time and I gave it 4 stars. Next, I read my first manga ever and it was Fullmetal Alchemist by Hiromu Arakawa. We follow 2 brothers who mishandled some experiment and lost a whole body in one case and some limbs in the other case, and now they are traveling and they are trying to find a solution how to get their bodies back. In each chapter they travel somewhere, they meet some villains and they try to save the day with their powers. It was fun, I like the characters and I'm not opposed to reading the next volumes, and I gave it 4 stars. And then I finally finally read Sophie's Choice by William Styron. This has been on my TBR for like 10 years and I even read a little bit in high school, but I had to return it, so now I finally finished it. This book takes place in 1947 and we follow a 22-year-old aspiring writer from Virginia named Stingo, who meets an interesting couple after moving to Brooklyn, and he becomes friends with them. Sophie is a Polish survivor of Auschwitz who works as a receptionist, and Stingo immediately falls in love with her. And Nathan is a charismatic Jewish-American biologist who's very knowledgeable about a lot of topics, including literature, so Stingo becomes fascinated by him. Very soon we find out that the relationship Nathan and Sophie have is toxic and even abusive, and potentially dangerous to them as well as people around them. During the book, Sophie tells her life story to Stingo, and we learn a lot about her growing up in Krakow, then living in Warsaw, the capital of Poland, during the war, and then about her deportation and imprisonment in Auschwitz, and finally about her getting to States and meeting Nathan. Although Sophie talks a lot about her feelings and thoughts when she tells a story, and I quite liked her as a character, I thought that there was something missing from the way she was portrayed and I couldn't really connect to her. I couldn't stand Nathan, and I got why Stingo was fascinated by him, but he was just irritating me from the beginning. Stingo is a very horny and privileged boy who tries to fight the stereotype that all Southerners are ignorant racists, but he's not as woke as he thinks he is. And his thoughts and actions were quite deplorable at times, but I still quite enjoyed his narration and he wasn't getting on my nerves that much. There was a lot of discussion about racism in the States, anti-Semitism in Europe, collective guilt, personal guilt, and making impossible choices in horrible situations, hence the title of the book. I have to say that I thought that there would be more time dedicated to the choice the title refers to, at least in retrospective, but it also made sense that neither of the characters wanted to dwell on it too much. When it comes to writing style, I would describe it as verbose and I want to say exhibitionist, but in a good way. It was less dry than I expected, but there was way too much foreshadowing, and wait till I tell you these moments, but first we had to sit through another episode of Stingo not getting laid again, and really his obsession with sex became old really quickly. Overall, I thought that it was a great book. I gave it 4 stars, and if you're interested in any of the themes or topics I mentioned, or in reading modern classics in general, it might be worth your time, but obviously there is a lot of content warnings to be aware of, like, you know, war, abusive relationships, racism, queerphobia, stuff like that. Another book I read in December was Do Not Say We Have Nothing by Madeleine Thien. It's a multi-generational story that takes place in China and Canada during the second half of the 20th century, and it talks about all of the horrible things that were happening in China, including the Cultural Revolution. I didn't know that much about history of China, so it was really interesting to read about these events. Although personally for me it's something that is quite hard to read about, given the history of my own country. I was born only 2 years after the oppressive regime in my country ended, and obviously the stuff that was happening in China was different and the scale of it was unimaginable. I was surprised about how of the elements of the oppression sounded really familiar to what my family or other people told me or what I read about. Reading about stuff like this always makes me so grateful that I can choose my own profession, I can travel, I can consume any books or music I want, and it's something that is not to be taken for granted because my parents' generation didn't have this while growing up. I don't really know how to talk about this book, but I love the characters, I love the writing, and the fact that music played really a big role in it. It's possible that I would enjoy it even more if I didn't have to read it painfully slowly, because I was looking for typos and stuff, and I felt like it may be dragged a little bit in places, but I would still definitely recommend it if it sounds like something you would enjoy, and I gave it 4 stars. Next book was a reread, and it was Tracy's Tiger by William Saroyan. I reread this book as part of my project to reread 5 books that I gave 5 stars to more than 5 years ago, and when December came around I reread only 1 book, so I had to step it up. I read this book for the first time when I was 15, and there is a lot of nostalgia about it, and it's really hard to explain what it's about. The main character, Tracy, is a young man who has a tiger, and it's a metaphor, and it's later explained, and it's a sweet and witty story, but this time around I wasn't as charmed by it as I used to be, so I lowered my rating to 4 stars. Another thing I reread was Animal Farm by George Orwell. As you can see, I read a lot of happy books in December. This is obviously a classic, and I like how Orwell himself described it, and he said that it is the history of a revolution that went wrong, and of the excellent excuses that were forthcoming at every step for the perversion of the original doctrine. I still think this is a brilliant book, and the way it describes manipulation, the abuse of power and oppression is chilling. If you haven't read this yet, I highly recommend it. It's very short, and yeah, it's still 5 stars for me. The next book I'm going to talk about is The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Again, there is a lot of nostalgia about this book from my teenage years, and it's totally stood the test of time for me. In case you don't know, this is a story about a pilot who has an accident in the desert, and while he's trying to repair his plane, he meets Little Prince. It's really not that much about the plot, it's just a story about love, commitment, and the ridiculousness and misery of some human behavior. It's heartwarming, heartbreaking, and all of that, so I definitely recommend it if you haven't read it yet, or even if you haven't read it for some time, because I had a great time rereading this. I forgot some of the scenes or quotes, and I was blown away all over again, and so it definitely stays in the 5 zone for me. And the last book I'm going to talk about in this wrap-up is After Dark by Haruki Murakami. I wanted to reread After Dark to see if I still like it, because Murakami is, or used to be, one of my favorite authors, although I think that I might be falling out of love with his books a little bit. After Dark is a short, kind of surrealistic novel that takes place during one night in a big city, and we follow 2 college-age sisters, Mari and Eri. Eri has worked as a model from a young age, and in her surrealistic part of the story, we watch her as she sleeps. She has slept for several weeks, so it's kind of a weird sleep. Mari wants to spend a night away from her home, so she reads at a restaurant, and there she meets her sister's friends named Takahashi. It's hard to explain what it's about, but there are themes like a sister's relationship, the blurred line between good and evil, between upstanding citizens and criminals, and also objectivization and abuse of women. At the beginning, Takahashi was quite getting on my nerves with some remarks about how most girls do or don't do this, and both him and Mari were kind of pretentious, but it made them also more relatable, because I think that I was also a bit pretentious around this age. I've already reread this a couple of times, and it used to be a 5-star read, but before I went into it this time, I was almost sure that I wasn't going to like it this much, but when I was drawn into the story again, I couldn't help but being impressed all over again, and it's still one of my favorite books by Murakami, so it stays at 5 stars. And yeah, these are all the books I read in December. Let me know in the comments if you read any of these, or if any of these sound interesting to you. You can also leave me any other comment and like or dislike this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!